October 12, 1913. Küsnacht, Switzerland. Just after midnight. The lake is still. A thin autumn fog drifts low across the water, dissolving the edges of the shoreline. Inside a modest house near Lake Zurich, a single oil lamp burns against the dark. The rest of Europe cannot sleep. Newspapers whisper of mobilization. Rail lines hum with troop movements. In Berlin, General Helmuth von Moltke studies maps under electric light, tracing borders with gloved fingers. But here there are no uniforms, no artillery diagrams, no commands shouted into the cold. Only a man sitting alone at a wooden desk. Carl Gustav Jung, 38 years old, physician, psychiatrist, former protege of Freud, stares into a blank page. Outside, the continent is tightening its jaw. Inside, something far less visible is beginning to rupture. He has been experiencing visions. Not dreams, not passing thoughts. Visions of rivers of blood flooding Europe, of collapsing civilizations, of ancient figures rising from beneath the soil of his mind. They come uninvited, vivid, unsettling, too coherent to dismiss. He writes them down by hand. Ink scratches the page. There is no audience, no patient observing him, no academic applause. His reputation, carefully built in Vienna and Zurich, hangs in fragile suspension. If his colleagues knew the nature of these inner images, they would likely call it psychosis. He continues anyway. Because something in him understands this, the real battlefield is not always visible. You can almost feel the silence pressing against the windows. No medals, no witnesses, only confrontation. Europe prepares for war with rifles and mobilization orders. Jung prepares with paper and dissent. He does not withdraw because he is weak. He withdraws because something deeper is demanding attention. And if you are honest, you recognize this pattern. There are moments in your own life when the outer world becomes loud: expectations, competition, social performance. Yet your greatest shifts do not occur during applause, they happen in private. Late at night. In your room. In silence. When no one is watching, something unguarded begins to surface. Jung would later describe this period as a deliberate descent into the unconscious, not as a patient, but as an explorer. He called it active imagination. But in 1913 there was no name yet, only the decision to sit still and let the images come. Across Europe, Moltke refines strategies for mobilizing the German army. Regiments drill in Brandenburg. Steel is forged into artillery pieces. The outer war is visible, measurable, applauded. Jung's war has no witnesses. And yet it may be more dangerous. Because the enemy he faces is not another nation. It is the structure of his own identity. The persona, the polished professional mask he has worn in lecture halls, begins to loosen. Titles lose their grip. Authority feels hollow. Without the gaze of others, who is he? The question does not arrive gently. It arrives as a tremor. You know this tremor. It comes when achievement stops feeling like selfhood, when the roles you play, competent, composed, agreeable, begin to feel strangely theatrical. And then you are alone. And something in you stands up. Not loudly, but undeniably. Jung writes of encountering figures in his inner visions: an old wise man, a dark stranger, a feminine presence emerging from shadow, archetypal forms. Though he does not yet use that word, they confront him, challenge him, undermine his certainty. He does not suppress them. He listens. This is not escapism. It is disciplined surrender. He continues documenting these visions in leather-bound folios that will later be known as the Red Book. Each page illuminated, calligraphic, medieval in tone, as if he is recording scripture from his own depths. Outside, Europe accelerates toward mechanized slaughter. Inside, Jung slows down. The contrast is almost unbearable. Because the outer world rewards spectacle, the inner world demands solitude. And solitude is not glamorous. It strips you. Without observers, there is no need to perform stability, no need to signal intelligence, no need to appear certain. What remains? For Jung, what remained was not fragility. It was power, but not the kind Moltke understood. Not the power of regiments or strategy. A quieter authority. An authority that arises when you face what you have been avoiding. When you allow the unconscious to speak without censor. This is why you sometimes feel strongest when you are alone. Because without witnesses, the persona loosens its grip. And beneath it, something older begins to breathe. In 1913, Jung does not yet know that war will erupt the following year. He does not know that his visions of blood-filled rivers will feel prophetic. He only knows that if he does not descend voluntarily, he risks being overtaken involuntarily. He chooses descent. He chooses silence over spectacle. He chooses confrontation over performance. And in doing so, he touches a psychological truth most people spend their lives avoiding. The deepest authority is born where no one can see it forming. The lamp flickers, ink dries, the lake outside remains still. But something irreversible has begun. And what Jung encounters next will not simply challenge his career. It will fracture his understanding of who he is. The room feels smaller now. The air heavier. Jung leans back from his desk, eyes unfocused, pulse steady but alert. The visions are no longer occasional. They arrive with force, scenes unfolding as if projected onto the darkness behind his eyelids. A desert landscape. A towering black serpent. A bearded prophet standing in crimson light. He does not look away. He lets the images develop. In Berlin, Generaloberst Helmuth von Moltke reviews contingency plans for the Schlieffen deployment. Rail timetables, artillery placements, cavalry movements through the Ardennes, every maneuver calculated, every variable controlled. Control. That is the word Jung begins to lose. Because what he is facing cannot be commanded. From a Jungian perspective, the ego, the conscious sense of I, believes it governs the psyche. It identifies with profession, reputation, rational thought, it maintains order, it presents coherence to the world. But the unconscious does not ask permission. It erupts. And when it does, the ego has two options: suppress it or surrender to the dialogue. Jung chooses dialogue. He begins speaking to the figures in his visions, not metaphorically, literally. He asks them questions, he allows them to answer. To an outsider, this would look like fragmentation. But internally, something else is happening. The persona, the socially constructed self, begins to crack. You know that crack? It appears when the version of you that functions in meetings, in friendships, in polite conversations suddenly feels hollow. When your rehearsed responses no longer carry weight, when compliments feel strangely misplaced. Because the part of you receiving them is not the part that feels real. Jung's professional identity had been formidable: president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, intellectual heir to Freud until their rupture in 1912 severed that path. Now, without the structure of Freud's approval, without institutional certainty, he stands alone. And in that aloneness, he feels something unexpected. Intensity. Not panic. Intensity. As if the ground beneath his identity has dissolved, but he has not fallen. Have you ever noticed that? When you stop performing, when you step away from the gaze of others, there is an initial disorientation, almost vertigo. And then a strange steadiness, as if a deeper axis has been waiting. Jung writes an elaborate Gothic script illustrating his inner encounters with precise detail. Armor, wings, symbols carved in red and gold pigment. He treats these visions not as symptoms but as messages. He does not rush to interpret them. He experiences them. This is critical. Because transformation does not occur through analysis alone, it occurs through encounter. Outside, Europe sharpens its weapons. Inside, Jung sharpens his awareness. The shadow begins to emerge. Not evil, not monstrous, but everything he has disowned. Ambition, doubt, aggression, spiritual longing, the hunger for recognition, the fear of irrelevance. The parts incompatible with his cultivated persona. From a Jungian perspective, the shadow contains the rejected aspects of the self, not because they are inherently dark, but because they threaten the image we maintain. And without witnesses, the image no longer needs protection. This is why solitude can feel so powerful. No one is there to reinforce who you are supposed to be. No one is reflecting your performance back to you. So something unedited rises. At first, it is uncomfortable. You see pettiness you didn't want to acknowledge, desires that contradict your values, resentments that refuse to dissolve. But if you remain still, if you do not immediately distract yourself, another layer appears. Strength. Because the energy required to suppress the shadow is immense. When suppression ceases, that energy returns. You feel it as clarity, as groundedness, as quiet authority. Jung begins to sense that his visions are not signs of breakdown but of expansion. The psyche is larger than the ego, wider than identity, deeper than reputation. And power does not belong exclusively to the conscious mind. Meanwhile, Molk's carefully structured strategies will soon collapse under the chaos of actual warfare. Plans will fracture on contact with reality. The illusion of control will dissolve in mud and artillery smoke. Outer structures are fragile. Inner structures, when integrated, are resilient. But integration requires descent. Jung's descent intensifies. He dreams of descending into the earth, of reaching a cavern where ancient symbols line the walls. He encounters a figure he later understands as the archetype of the wise old man, though at the time it feels like meeting an autonomous intelligence. The experience shakes him, because it suggests that the psyche is not merely personal. It is collective, ancient, shared. And if that is true, then the power he feels in solitude is not isolation. It is contact. Contact with something transpersonal. Something older than his biography. Have you ever felt that? Alone in your room, no phone, no conversation, no audience. And suddenly, your thoughts feel larger than your circumstances. As if you are plugged into something vast. That sensation is not ego inflation. It is ego reduction. When the persona quiets, the deeper self surfaces. Jung continues writing through the winter of 1913 into 1914. Snow gathers outside his study window. Europe edges closer to catastrophe. He cannot stop what is coming. But internally, he is constructing something that does not depend on political stability. An inner citadel. Not built from pride. Built from integration. And yet, the deeper he descends, the more dangerous it feels. Because there is a point in every psychological descent where certainty disappears entirely. Where you no longer know whether you are discovering yourself or losing yourself. And Jung is approaching that edge. July 28, 1914. Vienna declares war on Serbia. Telegrams move faster than reflection. Mobilization orders ripple through capitals like electric shock. In Berlin, Helmuth von Moltke authorizes deployment under the Schlieffen Plan. Trains loaded with infantry divisions thunder toward the Western Front. Steel wheels grind against iron tracks. The machinery of Europe is no longer theoretical. It is moving. In Küsnacht, church bells carry across Lake Zurich. Jung stands by the window of his study and listens. The war he foresaw in symbol has entered matter. Rivers of blood are no longer visions. They are inevitabilities. And something inside him shifts. Not triumph, not vindication. Responsibility. Because from a Jungian perspective, outer conflict reflects inner fragmentation. When shadow is not integrated within individuals, it erupts collectively. Nations project their disowned aggression outward. Enemies become containers for what is refused within. Jung understands this with unsettling clarity. And so the question intensifies. If Europe is collapsing because it cannot face its shadow, what happens if a single man refuses to face his own? The descent deepens. His visions grow darker. He encounters figures that accuse him of arrogance. Others mock his intellectual pride. Some tempt him with spiritual grandiosity, suggesting he is chosen, elevated, prophetic. This is the real danger. Not fear. Inflation. When the ego mistakes contact with the unconscious for superiority. Jung feels it, the seduction of believing himself exceptional because of his visions, the temptation to interpret them as proof of uniqueness. But solitude corrects him. There is no audience to reinforce delusion. No applause to stabilize fantasy. Just silence. And in silence, exaggeration collapses. You can almost feel the tension in that room, the thin line between revelation and madness, between integration and fragmentation. He continues anyway. Because something in him recognizes that stopping now would be more dangerous than continuing. Have you ever reached that point in your own inner life? where turning back would mean returning to a version of yourself that no longer fits. It feels like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, unsure whether the ice will hold. One more step. Jung steps. He allows the persona to dissolve further, titles lose meaning, professional rivalries fade, even his conflict with Freud recedes into something almost irrelevant. Because when identity loosens, comparison loses power. Without comparison, competition weakens. Without competition, the need for recognition softens. And beneath that softening, something unexpected appears. Sovereignty. Not dominance. Not control. Sovereignty. The quiet sense that your existence does not require external validation to feel legitimate. From a Jungian perspective, this is the beginning of individuation, the process by which the self becomes whole by integrating unconscious material rather than repressing it. But individuation is not glamorous. It often looks like isolation, like stepping away, like refusing to participate in collective hysteria. In 1914, as young men march under flags and brass bands, Jung does not join ideological fervor. He remains in Switzerland, serving as an army psychiatrist when required, observing the psychic breakdown of soldiers traumatized by trench warfare. Shell shock. Night terrors. Men who cannot speak after artillery bombardments. He sees what happens when the psyche is overwhelmed by forces it cannot process. And it confirms what his inner descent has shown him. What is not integrated internally will explode externally. But here is the paradox. The deeper Jung goes into solitude, the more stable he becomes. Not because he avoids darkness, but because he encounters it voluntarily. There is power in voluntary descent. When you choose to sit with your loneliness instead of distracting it. When you examine your envy instead of projecting it. When you admit your hunger for recognition without pretending you are above it. Energy returns. Clarity sharpens. You feel less reactive. Less easily provoked. Less desperate to be seen. Why? Because the part of you that demanded constant external reflection has been acknowledged. Seen internally. There is a moment, subtle but irreversible, when Jung realizes he is no longer afraid of his visions. They do not control him. He dialogues with them. He paints them. He records them. The unconscious is no longer an invader. It is a collaborator. And with that shift, the fear of dissolution recedes. The ego has not died. It has repositioned itself. Not as dictator, but as mediator. Outside, the Western Front stagnates into trench warfare. Mud, barbed wire, machine gun nests, the illusion of swift victory evaporates. Generals adjust strategies, but momentum falters. Inner work follows a similar pattern. There is an initial dramatic confrontation. Then a long, quiet integration. No spectacle, just steady reconstruction. Jung's authority no longer depends on his former alliance with Freud, nor on institutional leadership, nor on being recognized as the next great figure in psychoanalysis. His authority now comes from alignment. Alignment between conscious intention and unconscious truth. That is the power you feel when no one is watching. It is not performative. It is coherent. And coherence generates gravity. People may not understand it, they may not even notice it consciously, but they feel it. Because someone who has faced their shadow does not need to prove their strength. Their presence carries it. By 1916, as the Battle of the Somme consumes hundreds of thousands of lives, Jung publishes essays hinting at these inner discoveries. Carefully, measured, without spectacle. The world is tearing itself apart. He is assembling something inwardly that may outlast it. And yet one final realization remains. Because confronting the shadow is not the end of the descent. It is only the threshold. Beyond it waits something even more disorienting. The encounter with the self. Winter 1916. The Somme has frozen into silence. What remains of the battlefield is mud hardened like scar tissue. Rusted barbed wire cuts across white frost. The air smells of iron and old smoke. Thousands of young men lie beneath the soil, names recorded in ledgers, identities reduced to ranks and numbers. Europe is exhausted. And in Kusnacht, Jung sits once more at his desk. But something is different now. The panic that once accompanied his visions has quieted. The confrontations with shadow no longer destabilize him. He has stopped trying to control the images, stopped trying to interpret them too quickly. Now he waits. The lamp flickers. Outside, wind moves across Lake Zurich in slow, deliberate waves. He closes his eyes and descends. But this time, what meets him is not accusation, not chaos, not seduction. It is stillness. From a Jungian perspective, beyond the ego and beyond the shadow lies something more encompassing: the self. Not the everyday self of personality, but the organizing center of the entire psyche. The quiet axis around which conscious and unconscious revolve. It is not loud. It does not demand attention. It does not compete. It simply is. Jung begins to sense this presence in his inner dialogues, a figure that does not flatter him, does not shame him, does not argue. It steadies him. You know this presence. You have felt it in rare moments. Perhaps after a long period of emotional turbulence, when suddenly, without explanation, clarity settles over you, not excitement, not relief, just a grounded awareness that feels older than your current circumstances. As if you have stepped behind your own personality. As if the roles you play are visible, but no longer binding. Jung paints circular symbols during this period, mandalas, geometric forms balanced around a center point. He does not yet fully understand why he draws them, only that they calm him. Later, he will recognize them as spontaneous representations of psychic wholeness. But in 1916, they are simply anchors. The ego has relinquished control. The shadow has been acknowledged. And now, something more integrated begins to emerge. The power you feel when no one is watching is not defiance. It is alignment. When you are alone, the persona relaxes, the shadow softens because it is no longer suppressed, and beneath both, the deeper structure of the self becomes perceptible. It feels like sovereignty because it does not depend on comparison. It feels intense because it is undiluted. There is no audience to fragment your attention. No external mirror distorting your posture. Just you unobserved. Consider this: when Moltke drafted battle plans in Berlin, he relied on external variables, troop numbers, supply chains, geography. His authority depended on coordination, compliance, visible strength. When those variables shifted, his power collapsed. But Jung's emerging authority does not rely on variables. It is internal architecture. You can lose status and still retain it. You can lose approval and still remain centered. You can lose visibility and feel stronger than before. Because what is aligned inside you is not fragile. There is a quiet moment in Jung's journals when the tension dissipates. He no longer writes with urgency. The entries slow, the tone shifts from confrontation to integration. The descent is no longer dramatic. It is complete. Not perfected, nothing is ever perfected, but stabilized. He has faced the fragmentation of identity without fleeing. He has allowed the persona to dissolve without collapsing into chaos. He has integrated shadow without becoming consumed by it. And in doing so, he embodies something rare. Psychological adulthood. Not the adulthood of age or responsibility, but the adulthood of integration. This is why solitude feels powerful. Because in solitude, you are not fragmented by performance. You are not negotiating perception. You are not editing yourself in real time. You stand closer to the axis of your own psyche. Most people avoid this axis. It is quieter than stimulation, slower than validation. It does not reward you immediately. But when you touch it, something irreversible happens. You stop needing to be seen to feel real. And that is dangerous in the best possible way. Because a person who does not require constant external reflection becomes difficult to manipulate, difficult to provoke, difficult to intimidate. Their center is internal. By the end of the war in 1918, Europe will be reshaped by treaties and redrawn borders. Empires will collapse, flags will change. Jung's inner architecture, however, will remain. The work he began in 1913, alone, uncertain, unwitnessed, will form the foundation of analytical psychology, concepts of archetypes, individuation, the collective unconscious. But those theories were not born in lecture halls. They were born in silence, in a dimly lit room beside a lake, when no one was watching. And this is the realization that lingers long after the story ends. The power you feel in solitude is not imagination. It is proximity. Proximity to the part of you that does not perform. The part that does not fragment under observation. The part that existed before approval and will remain after it. Most people chase visibility. Very few cultivate inner sovereignty. But once you have touched it, once you have sat alone long enough to feel that quiet intensity rise within you, the applause of the world sounds different. Quieter, less necessary. And you begin to understand why your truest authority only surfaces in silence.